Discovery in the dunes. The setting sun painted the Sonoran Desert in shades of amber and purple as James Harrison adjusted the medical supplies in his patrol vehicle. 3 years after leaving the military's combat medical unit, he'd found purpose as a remote area first responder, patrolling the vast stretches of desert that most people never saw. The solitude suited him, helped quiet the memories of battlefields he'd rather forget. His radio crackled with static. Another quiet evening ahead. James was about to turn back toward the station when something caught his eye. A strange, silvery glint among the saguaro cacti, something that didn't belong in this ancient landscape of sand and stone. Pulling his vehicle to a stop, James grabbed his medkit and approached cautiously. Years of military training had taught him that anything unusual could be either an opportunity or a threat. As he drew closer, his heart nearly stopped. There, half buried in the sand, lay a woman, but unlike any he'd ever seen. Her skin had an opalescent quality that seemed to shift colors in the fading light, and what he'd initially taken for clothing appeared to be some kind of crystalline armor, now cracked and damaged. Dark liquid that definitely wasn't human blood seeped from several wounds. "Mom, can you hear me?" James knelt beside her, professional instincts taking over as he checked for vital signs. Her pulse was unlike anything he'd encountered, rapid, with a strange double-beat pattern. Her skin felt cool despite the desert heat, and faint markings that looked like circuitry traced patterns across her exposed arms. The woman's eyes fluttered open, revealing irises that shifted color like the aurora borealis. She spoke, but the sounds were unlike any language James had ever heard, musical and complex, with harmonics that seemed impossible for human vocal cords to produce. When she tried to move, James gently restrained her. "Easy there. You're injured. I'm here to help." He kept his voice calm and steady, the same tone he'd used with countless wounded soldiers. Though she couldn't understand his words, something in his manner seemed to reach her. She relaxed slightly, though her eyes remained alert, watching his every move. James worked quickly, applying pressure to the worst of her wounds. The crystalline armor complicated things. He couldn't remove it without proper tools, and he wasn't entirely sure he should. Whatever she was, wherever she'd come from, standard medical protocols might do more harm than good. As he worked, she spoke again, this time pressing a hand to her chest. "Lyra," she said, the word clear despite her obvious difficulty with human speech. "James," he responded, touching his own chest. A faint smile crossed her face before pain made her wince. The desert night was falling quickly now, bringing with it the dangerous cold that few outsiders expected. James knew he had to make a decision. Standard protocol would be to call this in, to get her to a hospital. But as he looked at her otherworldly features, he knew that would be signing her death warrant, or worse, condemning her to life as a laboratory specimen. Making his decision, James carefully lifted her. She was surprisingly light, despite the armor, as if the crystal segments somehow negated their own weight. He carried her to his vehicle, laying her across the back seat. "I'm taking you somewhere safe," he said, knowing she couldn't understand but hoping his tone would convey his intentions. "Just hold on." As he drove through the gathering darkness, James's mind raced. He had a small cabin about 20 miles out, officially a backup shelter for severe weather, but really more of a sanctuary when the world became too much. It would have to serve as an alien medical ward for now. Lyra drifted in and out of consciousness during the drive. Each time she woke, her eyes would find him in the rearview mirror, studying him with a mixture of fear and fascination. Once, she reached out and touched the window, her fingers leaving traces of light that faded slowly, like phosphines after staring at the sun. The cabin was exactly as he'd left it, isolated, secure, and stocked with enough supplies to last weeks if necessary. James carried Lyra inside, setting her gently on the bed. Under proper light, her injuries looked even worse. The crystal armor was damaged in several places, and beneath it, her skin showed evidence of what looked like energy burns. As he cleaned her wounds, James couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stepped into something much bigger than a simple rescue. The sophistication of her armor, the strange properties of her biology, the fact that she was clearly abandoned here. It all pointed to a story he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. Lyra's hand suddenly gripped his wrist with surprising strength. Her color-shifting eyes locked onto his, and she spoke again, this time in halting, carefully formed English. "They will come." James nodded slowly, understanding the warning in her tone. "Then we'll be ready when they do." He didn't know exactly what he was promising, but he knew he couldn't walk away. Not from someone in need, human or otherwise. As the desert night deepened outside, James settled into a chair beside the bed, medical supplies within reach. He treated countless wounds in his career, but never anything like this. Whatever had brought Lyra to Earth, whoever was hunting her, he had a feeling his life of quiet solitude was about to become far more complicated. The stars seemed especially bright through the cabin's window that night, and James couldn't help but wonder which one Lyra called home, and what price she paid to end up so far from it. Human interest. Secrets beneath the stars. Dawn broke over the desert with a whisper of gold. James watched as Lyra studied her reflection in the cabin's small mirror, her fingers tracing the healing marks on her face. The crystalline armor had begun to repair itself overnight, a process that seemed to draw energy from moonlight. Now it gleamed with an inner light, looking less like battle gear and more like living metal. "Your world," Lyra said carefully, her grasp of English growing stronger with each passing hour. "It is beautiful, but dangerous." She turned to face him, her aurora eyes containing depths of sadness he couldn't fathom, like mine was before. James handed her a cup of water, which she examined with scientific curiosity before drinking. "Want to tell me what happened? Who did this to you?" Lyra's expression darkened. "My people, we are divided. Some believe we should help younger civilizations. Others," she struggled for the words, "others think we should rule them." She stood, moving to the window with an ethereal grace that made her seem to float. "I was part of the Science Council. We discovered something." Her hand went to a small crystal pendant at her throat, previously hidden beneath the armor. Something that could change everything. James waited patiently as she gathered her thoughts. His medical training had taught him the value of silence, of letting people reveal their truths in their own time. "My world has technology you cannot imagine," she continued. "We can reshape matter, bend light, travel between stars. But we lost something important." She turned to face him. "We lost the ability to evolve, to change, to grow. And you found a way to fix that?" James asked, beginning to understand. Lyra nodded. "In primitive worlds, young worlds like Earth, we found the key. Life here still changes, adapts, becomes more. My research proved we could restore this ability to our people." Her expression hardened. "But the military council saw another use for my discovery. They wanted to weaponize it, use it to force evolution on other species, to create armies they could control." James thought of the warfare he'd seen, the destruction humans could unleash on each other. The idea of that kind of power in the hands of an advanced civilization made him shudder. "I refused," Lyra said simply. "So they tried to take my research by force. When that failed, they branded me a traitor, said I was conspiring with lesser species to undermine our civilization." A bitter smile crossed her face. They weren't entirely wrong. She held up her hand, and James watched in amazement as tiny points of light began to dance between her fingers. "The experiment changed me. I was the first successful test subject. That's why they'll never stop hunting me. I'm proof that their power isn't absolute." James approached slowly, watching the lights fade. "Those burns on your armor, energy weapons." Lyra nodded. "They attacked my lab, killed my research team. I escaped through an experimental portal, but they damaged it during transit. Instead of reaching my allies in the Pleiades, I crashed here." She met his gaze. They will track the portal's energy signature. They will come. How long do we have? Days, maybe less. James. She stepped closer, her presence making the air feel charged with static. You should leave. Find somewhere safe. I've seen enough death. James thought of the soldiers he'd treated, the ones he couldn't save. He thought of the oath he'd taken as a medic, to preserve life regardless of circumstance. I'm not going anywhere. Besides, he managed to smile. I know this desert better than anyone. If we need to hide to run, this is where we do it. Lyra studied him with those impossible eyes. You are different from what they told us about humans. They said you were primitive, violent, unworthy of contact. Oh, we can be all those things, James admitted. But we can also surprise you. Their conversation was interrupted by a high-pitched tone emanating from Lyra's armor. Her face paled. They're scanning this sector, looking for energy signatures that don't belong. James moved quickly, grabbing emergency supplies and medical equipment. Then let's not be here when they find one. My patrol vehicle has a full tank of gas and knows these back roads like an old friend. As they hurried to the vehicle, Lyra paused, placing her hand on the cabin wall. A subtle wave of energy pulsed outward, and the building's heat signature began to fade. That will mask our trail, but not for long. James started the engine as the first rays of sun crested the eastern mountains. You said your people lost the ability to adapt, he said, steering them onto a barely visible desert track. Well, adaptation is what humans do best, especially when we're backed into a corner. Lyra secured herself in the passenger seat, her armor glinting in the dawn light. The military council believes they have planned for every possibility. That's their mistake, James said, accelerating as they headed deeper into the desert's maze of canyons and valleys. You can't plan for every possibility. You can only be ready to improvise. As they drove, James caught glimpses of unusual atmospheric disturbances high above, signs that someone or something was indeed searching the area. But he had grown up in this harsh landscape, learned its secrets, its hiding places. If Lyra's pursuers wanted to find them, they would have to do it on his terms, in his territory. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a labyrinth of sand and stone that had protected secrets for millennia. It would protect one more, James decided, even if he had to rewrite his understanding of the universe to make it happen. Pursuit through paradise. Heat rippled across the desert floor as James guided the vehicle through a narrow canyon. They'd been moving for 6 hours, taking routes only locals would know, doubling back occasionally to confuse any pursuit. Beside him, Lyra monitored strange patterns of light on her armor surface. What she'd explained was an early warning system for tracking technology. The patterns are changing, she said suddenly, her voice tense. They're not just scanning anymore. They're deploying ground units. James steered them into a hidden alcove, the vehicle's dusty exterior blending with the red rock walls. What exactly are we dealing with? Hunter drones, Lyra replied, her fingers tracing the shifting patterns. Autonomous units designed to operate in hostile environments. They're adaptive. She looked at him meaningfully, like I am. As if to demonstrate, she pressed her hand against the vehicle's dashboard. James watched in amazement as her skin momentarily took on the texture and color of the material before returning to its opalescent state. That's how you survived the crash, he realized. Your body adapted to the impact. She nodded. The experiment didn't just restore our ability to evolve. It accelerated it, made it responsive to immediate threats. Her expression darkened. The military council wants to weaponize this ability, create soldiers who can instantly adapt to any battlefield. A distant humming sound caught their attention. James killed the engine, and they sat in tense silence as something passed overhead, something that cast no shadow despite the bright sunlight. Cloaking technology, Lyra whispered. They're getting closer. James considered their options. The canyon offered protection, but it was also a potential trap. They needed somewhere with more tactical advantages. Then he remembered something from his patrol routes, something that might just give them an edge. "There's an old copper mine about 20 miles east," he said, "abandoned in the 60s. The locals say it's haunted because compasses go crazy around it. Something about the mineral deposits affecting magnetic fields." Lyra's eyes lit up with understanding. Natural interference. It could mask our energy signatures, make it harder for them to track us. "And I know those tunnels," James added. "Mapped them during search and rescue training. If we have to make a stand, that's where we do it." They waited until the humming faded before starting the engine again. James took them through a series of increasingly narrow passages, using the landscape to stay hidden from aerial observation. As they drove, Lyra told him more about her world, a planet orbiting a binary star system, where the constantly shifting light had led to the evolution of their color-changing skin. "Our cities were built from living crystal," she said, a note of longing in her voice. "They grew and changed with us, adapted to our needs. But then we learned to control that growth, to force the crystals into until you couldn't adapt anymore," James finished. "You traded evolution for control." "Yes, we thought we had reached perfection." She smiled sadly. "We forgot that perfection is the enemy of growth." Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp alert from Lyra's armor. In the distance, a column of sand rose unnaturally into the air. Something large was moving beneath the surface. "Burrower units," Lyra explained grimly. "They'll try to force us into a predetermined path, trap us between teams." James accelerated, taking them down a steep incline that would have been suicide for anyone who didn't know exactly where the stable ground was. The vehicle bounced and slid, but he maintained control, years of experience guiding his hands. They'd reached the mine entrance as the sun was directly overhead, casting minimal shadows. The old timber supports creaked in the wind, and the entrance gaped like a black mouth in the rock face. "We'll need light," James said, reaching for his emergency gear. But Lyra was already ahead of him. She touched her armor, and portions of it began to glow with a soft, steady luminescence. The light seemed to flow like water, gathering in her palm until it formed a floating sphere. "That's handy," James commented, trying to maintain his composure despite the incredible display. "A simple manipulation of biophotonic energy," Lyra said, then caught his expression and laughed, a sound like wind chimes that echoed through the mine entrance. "Sorry. Sometimes I forget that what's basic science for my people seems like magic to others." They entered the mine together, the glowing sphere lighting their way. The tunnels were a maze of intersecting passages, but James moved with confidence, leading them deeper into the earth. The walls were rich with copper deposits, creating natural interference patterns that made Lyra's armor flicker and pulse. "It's working," she said. "Their scanning technology will have trouble penetrating these formations." She paused, placing her hand against a crystal vein in the rock. "There's something else here. These minerals, they're not so different from the living crystals of my world. With enough time, I might be able to." A distant explosion cut off her words, followed by the sound of falling rock. Their pursuers had arrived, and they were done with subtlety. "Time," James said grimly, checking his supplies, "is something we're running out of." Lyra's expression hardened, her skin taking on a subtle metallic sheen that matched the copper in the walls. "Then we make our stand here. Your world, your rules of engagement." James nodded, already formulating a plan. He knew every twist and turn of these tunnels, every unstable section, every potential choke point. If Lyra's people wanted a demonstration of human adaptability, they were about to get one. The hunt was on, but this time, the hunters might find themselves becoming the hunted. Echoes of home. Deep in the copper mine, James and Lyra worked swiftly to prepare their defenses. The distant sound of drilling echoed through the tunnels. The hunter drones were boring new entrances, trying to surround them. "Tell me more about these drones," James said as he rigged the last of his emergency flares. "Weaknesses, vulnerabilities, anything." Lyra's hands moved over the crystal formations in the wall, coaxing them to grow and shift in subtle patterns. They're designed to be perfect healing machines, adaptive armor, self-repairing systems, linked intelligence. She paused, a faint smile crossing her face. But perfection has its price. They can't truly improvise, can't think beyond their programming. A closer explosion shook loose fragments of rock from the ceiling. James steadied himself against the wall, feeling the vibrations through his boots. How many? At least 6 ground units, plus whatever aerial support they brought. Lyra's armor pulsed with warning patterns. And something else. Someone. Before James could ask for clarification, a voice echoed through the tunnels. Not the mechanical sound he'd expected, but something musical and complex, like Lyra's native language. Lyra's face went pale, her skin losing its opalescent sheen. "No," she whispered. "Not him." The voice came again, closer this time. Lyra responded, her words sharp and angry. Then she turned to James, her eyes burning with an intensity he hadn't seen before. "That was Command Arbiter Ven, my former." She struggled with the translation. "Husband." James felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. "You were married to one of them." "I was married to the man who led the Military Council's research division, who twisted my work into something horrible." Her hands clenched into fists. "Who ordered the death of my entire research team when I refused to cooperate." The revelation hung in the air between them. James thought of all she'd lost, all she'd sacrificed to prevent her discovery from being weaponized. "That's why they want you back so badly. It's personal." Lyra nodded grimly. "Ven believes in the absolute superiority of our species. My research proved that we need other worlds, need contact and exchange with lesser species to continue evolving. It destroyed everything he believed in." Another explosion, closer this time. James could hear the whir of mechanical limbs, the hum of energy weapons powering up. They were running out of time. "Your experiment," he said suddenly, "the one that changed you. Could it work on humans?" Lyra's eyes widened as she understood what he was suggesting. "It's dangerous, unpredictable. The process could kill you. And if we do nothing, we both die anyway." He met her gaze steadily. "You said humans are good at adapting. Let me prove it." For a moment, she stood motionless, internal conflict visible in the shifting colors of her skin. Then she reached for the crystal pendant at her throat. "This contains the last sample of the original formula. I've been using it to stabilize my own changes." She hesitated. "Are you sure?" The sound of mechanical walkers was getting closer. James thought of all the lives he tried to save as a medic, all the times he'd wished he could do more. "I'm sure." Lyra removed the pendant and pressed it into his palm. The crystal was warm, pulsing with an inner light that seemed to reach into him, searching for something. "Focus on what you need to become," she instructed. "The formula enhances natural adaptation. Your body will respond to your strongest impulse." James closed his eyes, thinking of the copper in the walls around them, the way it interfered with electronics. He thought of protection, of absorption, of becoming something that could stand against advanced technology. The crystal flared hot in his hand, and then the sensation of burning spread up his arm and throughout his body. He gasped as every cell seemed to ignite, his awareness expanding in impossible ways. He could feel the metal in the walls, could sense the electromagnetic fields generated by the approaching drones. When he opened his eyes, Lyra was staring at him in wonder. His skin had taken on a coppery sheen, and he could feel new abilities awakening, responding to his needs. The burning sensation faded, replaced by a feeling of power he'd never experienced. "Remarkable," Lyra breathed. "Your adaptation is even faster than mine was. Perhaps because your species is naturally more." She was cut off by the arrival of the first hunter drone, its metallic form unfolding from the tunnel entrance like a deadly flower. James reacted instinctively, reaching out with his new awareness. The drone's electromagnetic field wavered, its systems disrupted by the copper now infused in his cells. More drones appeared, their weapons charging. But now James could see the patterns in their energy fields, could predict and counter their movements. Together, he and Lyra began their defense, her ability to manipulate crystal merging perfectly with his new power to disrupt technology. Then a figure stepped through the chaos. Tall, elegant, with skin that shimmered like platinum. Arbiter Ven's eyes fixed on Lyra, with an intensity that was almost physical. "My dear," he said in perfect English, his voice carrying centuries of assumed superiority, "did you really think you could hide among these primitives forever?" Lyra's response was to create a barrier of living crystal between them. "These primitives, as you call them, understand something you never did, Ven. True strength comes from growth, from change, not from enforced perfection." The battle that followed would reshape all their understanding of adaptation, evolution, and the true meaning of advancement. Dawn of Two Worlds. The copper mine had become a battlefield of impossible technologies and evolutionary marvels. Hunter drones lay disabled, their advanced systems scrambled by James's newly acquired abilities. Crystal formations grew like frozen lightning across the walls, Lyra's defensive barriers reflecting the glow of energy weapons. Arbiter Ven stood unmoved, his platinum skin rippling with barely contained power. "Look at what you've done, Lyra," he said, gesturing at James. "Contaminated another species with your corruption. This is why our ancestors sealed off contact with developing worlds." "No," Lyra countered, moving to stand beside James. "This is exactly why they were wrong. Look at him, Ven. In minutes, he adapted more successfully than our people have in centuries. We didn't seal ourselves off to protect others. We did it because we were afraid of change." James could feel the copper deposits in the walls responding to his presence, creating interference patterns that made the remaining drones twitch and stutter. His military training combined with these new abilities, giving him insights into weaknesses in Ven's tactical decision. "Your experiment ends here," Ven declared. His form began to shift, taking on aspects of the weaponry around him. "The Council has authorized final containment protocols." "The Council is wrong," Lyra said firmly. "And you're about to learn why." What followed was beyond anything James had witnessed in his years of combat. Ven's technological superiority clashed with Lyra's evolutionary adaptations and James's hybrid abilities. The mine tunnels became a maze of shifting crystal and electromagnetic pulses. But James noticed something crucial. Each time Ven adapted, it was a calculated, predetermined response. His changes followed military protocols, expected patterns. But James and Lyra were truly evolving, responding to each moment with genuine innovation. "Lyra," James called out as he disrupted another drone's targeting systems. "The crystals in the wall. Can you make them amplify electromagnetic fields?" Her eyes lit up with understanding. Without a word, she pressed her hands to the nearest crystal formation. The mineral structures began to pulse with energy, creating a resonating chamber throughout the mine. Ven sensed the danger too late. As he moved to strike, James released a massive electromagnetic pulse, amplified by the crystal network Lyra had created. The wave of energy caught Ven in mid-transformation, disrupting his carefully controlled adaptations. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Ven's perfect features. What is this?" "This is true adaptation," Lyra said, her voice carrying a note of both sadness and triumph. "Not the controlled evolution you wanted to impose on the universe, but real, messy, unpredictable change." The crystals throughout the mine began to glow with increasing intensity. James could feel them responding to both his and Lyra's presence, creating a feedback loop of energy and adaptation. The remaining drones started to malfunction, their linked intelligence overwhelmed by the chaos of genuine evolution. Ven made one last attempt to regain control, his form shifting through various defensive configurations. But each change was predictable, limited by his inability to truly improvise. The crystalline network responding to James and Lyra's combined abilities proved too much for his systems. In a flash of light and energy, Ven's perfect form finally broke down. The Arbiter collapsed, his adaptive systems overloaded, leaving him in his base form, looking far more vulnerable than before. As the dust settled, James and Lyra stood together in the transformed mine. The walls glittered with new crystal growths, humming with harmonics that bridged their two species' technologies. The disabled hunter drones lay scattered like fallen leaves, monuments to the failure of controlled perfection. "It's over," Lyra said softly, approaching Ven's unconscious form. "The Council will have to accept the truth now. They'll see that isolation leads to stagnation, not perfection." James felt the copper-infused changes in his body stabilizing, becoming a permanent part of him. "What happens now?" Lyra turned to him, her eyes reflecting the crystal lights around them. "Now we have a choice. Your world knows nothing of mine. We could keep it that way, hide all evidence of what happened here. Or we could show them a better way. Not conquest, not isolation, but genuine exchange." She gestured at their surroundings. "Look what we accomplished together in just hours. Imagine what our peoples could learn from each other over years, centuries." James looked at his transformed hands, thinking of all the possibilities. Medical applications, defensive technologies, new ways of understanding the universe itself. "It won't be easy. Humans can be just as afraid of change as your people. Good thing they'll have you to help them adapt," Lyra said with a smile. "After all, you've become living proof that our species can evolve together." As the first rays of dawn penetrated the mine entrance, James and Lyra began making plans. They would need to contact certain authorities, demonstrate their discoveries carefully, build trust gradually. It would be a long process, full of challenges and setbacks. But as they emerged from the mine into the desert sunrise, James realized something profound. In trying to save Lyra, he'd helped forge a connection between two civilizations. Their story would become a bridge between worlds, proof that the greatest strength lies not in perfection, but in the willingness to grow, to change, to adapt. The desert stretched before them, vast and full of possibility. Somewhere above, beyond the blue earth sky, Lyra's world waited. But for now, they had work to do here, helping both their peoples learn to embrace the beautiful uncertainty of evolution. And as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the sand, James and Lyra began their next adaptation, learning how to be ambassadors of a future neither of their worlds had imagined possible.